December 1941, outside Moscow. A German soldier presses his hands against a rifle bolt that will not move. Frozen solid. He breathes on it. Nothing. Around him, an entire company is doing the same thing. Hundreds of men, blowing warm air onto steel that refuses to obey them. Weeks earlier, this same soldier laughed. He'd seen the Soviet prisoners being marched past his position, thick felt boots, padded jackets, fur hats with flaps over the ears, peasant clothes. Primitive, his officer had called it backward equipment for a backward army. The men had joked about it over cigarettes, safe in their sleek gray coats, confident that Moscow would fall before the first real frost. Then the temperature dropped to -40. Then, his rifle oil turned to paste. Then his engine grease froze into rock. Then, out of a white wall of snow that swallowed sound itself, came men who did not look cold at all. Men who moved like they belonged there. By the time the shooting started, half the German company couldn't fire back. This is the story of a joke that cost an army its war. Of one piece of peasant footwear that out-engineered the finest military machine in Europe. And of the arrogance that stopped Adolf Hitler from ever admitting he was wrong, until it was far, far too late. To understand the boots, you first have to understand the trap. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, with over 3 million men. It was, on paper, unstoppable. German planners expected total victory within 10 weeks. Some officers were told not to bother packing winter uniforms at all. Why would they need them? The war would be over by September. August came. Then, September. The Wehrmacht was still advancing, but slower now, bleeding men, and fuel with every mile deeper into Russian territory. October brought the Rasputitsa, the quagmire season, when rain turned every road into a river of mud that swallowed trucks up to their axles. Panzer divisions that had rolled through France in days now crawled through Russia at a few miles per day. Then came November, and the mud froze solid. For a brief moment, German commanders were relieved hard ground meant the tanks could move again. But the same freeze that hardened the roads was doing something far more dangerous to the men driving on them. German soldiers were still wearing the same wool coats issued for a summer campaign. No insulated boots, no proper gloves, no winter grease for their weapons. Standard rifle oil didn't just slow down in the cold, it froze into a solid block, jamming bolts shut. Tank engines needed fires lit underneath them for hours, just to turn over in the morning. Machine guns, the backbone of German defensive firepower, seized up mid-battle. And the soldiers themselves were dying without ever meeting an enemy. Frostbite cases were being counted in the tens of thousands. Some units reported more men lost to the cold than to combat. Medics were amputating blackened fingers and toes by candlelight, working in field hospitals that were themselves barely above freezing. Hitler had been warned. Quartermasters had requested winter uniforms as early as August. The requests were denied, delayed, buried in bureaucracy, because admitting the army needed winter gear meant admitting the war wouldn't be won by winter. And admitting that was not something the Führer was willing to do. So an army built to win in 10 weeks found itself fighting, freezing, and dying in a war that had already lasted 6 months with no end and no proper coat in sight. On the other side of the front line, a very different army was learning to use the cold as a weapon instead of an enemy. The Red Army of 1941 was, by every conventional measure, the underdog. Stalin's purges had gutted its officer corps years earlier, executing or imprisoning thousands of experienced commanders. Its early battles against the German invasion had been catastrophic. Entire armies encircled and destroyed, millions taken prisoner in a matter of months. German intelligence considered Soviet fighting ability a joke. One German general reportedly dismissed the Red Army as a mass of untrained peasants with rifles. But among the men rebuilding that shattered army were quartermasters and frontline officers who understood something the German high command refused to accept. This war would be decided as much by logistics and clothing as by tanks and guns. They looked at their own soldiers, many of them literally drawn from villages in Siberia and the Urals. Men who had grown up working outdoors in temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in an hour. And instead of trying to modernize them into a Western-style army overnight, they leaned into what those soldiers already knew. Fresh Siberian divisions, transferred west once Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack from the east, arrived at the front already equipped the way their villages had equipped them for generations. Nobody in Berlin thought to ask what these backward soldiers were actually wearing on their feet, or why it mattered more than any tank. The man usually credited with turning this practical, unglamorous knowledge into official doctrine wasn't a celebrated tactician. He was closer to a quartermaster general unglamorous work, easily mocked by officers obsessed with maneuver and firepower. He pushed hard for mass production of a single, humble item that most Western militaries considered beneath serious military engineering: felt boots. Picture the reaction in a German officer's mess if you'd told them the Red Army's secret weapon was a boot made of pressed wool. The Valenki thick, soft, seamless felt boots looked like something a farmer's grandmother would make by hand. No steel toe, no leather, no laces, buckles, or waterproofing. To a German boot designer trained in precision engineering, they looked almost comically primitive. A museum piece, not a weapon of war. But felt does something rubber and leather cannot. It traps warm air in millions of tiny fibers, insulating the foot even when soaked through. German jackboots, by contrast, were leather, and leather conducts cold straight into the skin. Worse, German boots were tight-fitting by design, cutting off circulation the moment feet swelled in extreme temperatures. That was a death sentence at -30. Soviet soldiers paired the Valenki with the Telegreka, a simple quilted cotton jacket, again cheap, again unglamorous, again dismissed by German intelligence as evidence of a poorly supplied army. In reality, the quilting trapped air in layers exactly the way modern insulated jackets still do today. Then there were the skis. Entire Soviet ski battalions moved silently across terrain that swallowed German trucks and half-tracks whole, and the T-34 tank-wide tracks that spread its weight across snow and mud where narrower German panzers sank and stalled. None of it looked impressive. None of it looked like the future of warfare. German propaganda newsreels had spent 2 years mocking Soviet equipment as crude and outdated. They were about to learn the difference between looking modern and surviving. The first thing German soldiers noticed wasn't the boots. It was the silence. Soviet ski troops in white camouflage smocks could cross open snowfields without a sound, appearing at the edge of visibility like shapes forming out of a blizzard. German sentries, half frozen and exhausted from nights spent trying to keep their weapons from seizing up, began reporting figures that vanished the moment flares lit the sky. Rumors spread through the ranks faster than any official intelligence report talk of snow ghosts, of Siberian soldiers who felt no cold at all, who could survive conditions no German could endure. It didn't matter that this was exaggeration. Fear doesn't need to be accurate. It only needs to spread. Meanwhile, the practical terror was just as real. German machine gun crews would open fire, only for their weapons to jam after a few rounds as frozen lubricant gummed the mechanism. In the same moment, Soviet soldiers' boots dry, joints unrestricted, weapons treated with cold-resistant grease developed specifically for the Eastern Front, kept moving, kept firing, kept advancing. There is a particular kind of psychological collapse that happens to a soldier who realizes his equipment, the thing he was trained to trust with his life, has simply stopped working. It is not the same as facing a stronger enemy. It is worse. It feels like the world itself has turned against you. German war diaries from this period describe men abandoning positions not because they were outfought, but because they could no longer physically operate their own weapons, could no longer feel their own hands, and could hear an enemy moving that they could not see. Officers reported soldiers refusing orders to advance not out of cowardice, but because advancing meant leaving whatever meager shelter they'd found, and shelter had become more valuable than ground. The Red Army wasn't just fighting the Wehrmacht anymore. It was fighting an army that had started, quietly and terribly, to fear the winter itself, and every Soviet soldier who emerged from a whiteout unharmed became proof, in German minds, that the cold had chosen a side. There's a particular sound that shows up again and again in accounts from that front, not gunfire, not explosions, but the deep, hollow thump of frozen ground being struck by entrenching tools that couldn't dig in properly, followed by the low, constant murmur of men talking themselves into staying awake. Sleep in that cold could mean never waking up. So soldiers stood in place for hours, stamping their feet, slapping their own arms, terrified of the one enemy no rifle could shoot their own exhaustion. Against that backdrop, a fresh Siberian soldier stepping out of the tree line, breathing steady, boots dry, rifle firing on the first pull of the trigger, wasn't just a tactical problem. He was a message. And every German unit that received that message understood it instantly, without a single word being spoken. On December 5th, 1941, the Red Army launched its counteroffensive outside Moscow, fresh Siberian divisions, properly equipped for the conditions, hitting a German force that was, in the most literal sense, freezing to death in its own trenches. The results were immediate and brutal. German units that had been within sight of Moscow spires just weeks earlier were forced into a chaotic retreat. Entire divisions abandoned heavy equipment because vehicles wouldn't start. Wounded men froze before medics could reach them. It was the first major defeat of the German army in the entire war, inflicted not only by Soviet courage, but by Soviet boots. Hitler's response revealed exactly how deep the arrogance ran. Rather than acknowledge the failure of planning that had left his army without winter equipment, he issued a no-retreat order, Fur Directive No. 39 commanding soldiers to hold ground at all costs. Historians still debate whether that order saved Army Group Center from total collapse, or simply guaranteed thousands of additional deaths from frostbite and exposure among men who might otherwise have withdrawn to defensible, sheltered positions. Compare this to what happened wherever German commanders, quietly and against official policy, improvised. Some units captured Soviet felt boots and winter coats from the dead and wounded, using them despite regulations. Survival rates for those men, according to post-war accounts, were noticeably better than for units that stuck rigidly to standard-issue leather boots and wool coats. The tragedy wasn't the cold. Russia had always been cold, and everyone in the German high command knew it before a single soldier crossed the border. The tragedy was that a solution existed cheap, simple, already proven by the very army they were fighting, and pride kept it out of German hands, until tens of thousands had already died, proving the point. 3.5 years after that frozen rifle bolt in the snow outside Moscow, Soviet soldiers walked into Berlin. Many of them were still wearing Valenki, the same peasant boots a German company had laughed at in the autumn of 1941, carried Red Army soldiers through Stalingrad, through Kursk, across 1,000 miles of Eastern European winter, and finally into the ruins of the Reich Chancellery itself. The joke that had cost a German soldier his ability to fire his own weapon in December 1941 had, by May 1945, walked its wearers all the way to Hitler's front door. There's a strange kind of justice in that image an army mocked for its equipment, outfitting itself with the humblest materials available, standing victorious in the capital of the very military that once called it backward. Not because the boots themselves won the war, but because the arrogance that dismissed them was the same arrogance that dismissed the war's true cost from the very beginning. Somewhere in the historical record, that soldier who once breathed uselessly onto a frozen rifle bolt made it home. Or he didn't. But the moment lives on in every account of that winter, the confident laughter of men who believed European engineering could never lose to a felt boot, and the silence that followed once the snow began and never really stopped.